Hi everyone, I want to tell you about a story from my family. It's actually a promise that my mom made. Though some of you might not know, but the Bills actually used to go to Super Bowls like all the time. And when that was the case, my mom promised that if the Bills ever won a Super Bowl, she'd buy us one of the championship hats, my brother and I. And eventually the promise expanded to the World Series as well. I used to root a little bit for the Blue Jays, my brother rooted for the Mets. And so in '92, the Blue Jays won a World Series, and I got a hat. And actually won twice in a row, and so I got another hat. I do like this one, the tagline on it, "We win." Took a lot of time to think that up. And so I got a second hat when they won that second time. At some point along the lines, as a joke, I started pretending to cheer for the Denver Broncos, and my mom, going along with the joke, when the Denver Broncos won the Super Bowl in '97, she got me one of those hats. And then they won the next year, '98, got me another hat. And then they won a couple of years ago when Peyton Manning was on the team, and I got another hat. And so I have these 5 championship hats. It's pushing my ears down and making me look like an elf. So I have these 5 championship hats, but you'll notice that none of them have anything to do with the original promise. The original promise was, if the Bills win a Super Bowl, I'll get you a hat. And so far, that promise hasn't gotten an opportunity to come to fruition. I really hope it will, right? Maybe this is the year. Maybe this is the year I'll finally get my Bills World Champions, Super Bowl champions hat. But I don't know. I guess that's kind of the way with promises sometimes in our world, right? Sometimes we make a promise and we have every intention of keeping it, but for whatever reason, maybe we can't. Or we don't for one reason or another. Sometimes there are those times where we don't, and that's a bad thing. And sometimes there are those times where we just can't keep our promises. My mom just hasn't been able to keep her promise of, I'll get you a Bills Super Bowl hat, because the Bills haven't cooperated and won any Super Bowls for her. This is getting really heavy also. I didn't know that 5 hats would be so heavy, so I'll just decorate myself. I'll adorn myself with some hats. There we go. I'm wearing this is the silliest one. It's got like a boat anchor and stuff on it. Anyway, sometimes promises just don't get a chance to be filled in. But that's not the case with God. When God makes a promise, that promise is good. When God makes a promise, things are going to happen that make that promise come true. God will never let us down on his promises. And we get a really cool story about God keeping and making promises this week with Abraham. Abraham was just a guy who was very faithful and loved God. And so God promised him a bunch of things. He promised him that he'd have a land all his own. He promised him that he'd have a big family. He promised him that his family would be kings. All kinds of big promises for Abraham. The challenge was that Abraham and his wife Sarah were older at the time, and they didn't even think that they could have kids. So if they couldn't have kids, how would that promise get fulfilled? How could they have a land full of people that all started with them? They have a lot of doubts about if God will be able to keep the promises. Next week we'll talk about how those promises do become even more full. But this week we get to see Abraham and his wife and his family go to that land that God had for them. Right? They go to the land that God said would be theirs, and half of that promise is already fulfilled. And so even though they have all kinds of doubts about if the promise could be fulfilled, and if they could have kids, a kid, even though they're so late in their life, but at the same time, God already gave them this land that they didn't think they could have either. Today is half of the story. We get half the story, but obviously, with this setup that I did here of God fulfilling promises, you know that kid's coming, right? You know that even though they're older, that Mary, that's Jesus. That's a different kid entirely. But we'll get to that eventually. That Abraham and Sarah, even though they're older, they're going to have that kid. They're going to have that land. It's going to, lead to the kingdom that God promised them. And God keeps his promises. And God's made you promises too. Promises even better than a Bills Super Bowl victory may be sometime happening. God's promise for you is that he'll always love you, he'll always care for you, and no matter what happens and where you go in your life, God will always forgive you and welcome you home. God keeps his promises. We get to see that partway with Abraham's story this week. We'll get to see more of it in the upcoming weeks. But just what I want you to walk away knowing, God keeps his promises. God will never let you down. Circumstances will never stop God from keeping his promises. God will keep his promises. And those promises, even better than a Super Bowl win, even better than anything you can imagine, it's a promise to always love you, always care for you, and always be there for you. See you next week, everyone.